Hi, I'm Ella. I'm in a hopefully soundproof room of the library, and I'm here to talk to you today about the gay voice or gay accent or whatever you want to call it, why it exists, if it exists, first of all, and then why, and a little bit about where it maybe comes from. And I got really interested in this topic because I think accents have always really freaked me out. I think voices have always really freaked me out. It freaks me out that there's such a huge part of ourselves that we don't really know what we sound like, and also there's this huge part of ourselves that we don't have a lot of control over. So I got into the study of linguistics, specifically phonetics, which is the study of sounds, to basically try and demystify that process, to figure out what exactly is going on when we hear these things that we sort of subconsciously know and categorize but can't really consciously place. So the other reason I wanted to do this video was because I was thinking a lot about what I really enjoy about linguistics, but specifically the times where I do linguistics and I'm really, really happy, and I realized it's not actually when I'm doing it. Frankly, I'm not actually that good at it. My linguistics minor is like destroying my GPA. But anyway, what I realized is what I really like about linguistics isn't the doing part or even the learning part. It's the part where after class I go and I sort of sit down with my friends in the cafeteria or with a coffee and I tell them about what I learned in class. It feels like when you're in school and you do show and tell, you know, when you're a little kid. And so I guess this is me doing grown-up show and tell for you. Just sort of to start, a gay voice is really nebulous and hard to define, but we also, not all of us, but a lot of us sort of know that it exists or can place it when we hear it. And specifically, I'm talking about men with gay voices. Also, if I look over here, it's because I have my notes over here. I'm not that professional. I don't have it memorized. But anyway, I mean, it's funny because a lot of accents are really directly determined by our linguistic surroundings. You know, you grew up in the South, you have a Southern accent, but gay voices sort of aren't. I mean, they sort of are because, you know, if you surround yourself with gay people, you might start sounding more gay, but it's also, you know, gayness isn't hereditary, and it's not like you have a city that only has gay men in it. And yet, a lot of boys who later come out tend to exhibit similar linguistic features when they're young, and it's not super clear as like a non-linguist to see, oh, this is where they're learning it, this is where they're getting it from. And it's very much not intentional, you know, subconscious in the way that all other accents are subconscious, and yet it's not as clearly coming from like a direct linguistic lineage. And I was just fascinated by that. I thought that that was so strange and really, really cool. In studies, listeners tend to agree on what voices sound gay and what voices don't sound gay. So there is some sort of data that we're subconsciously or consciously picking up on. There's some sort of traits, there's some types of sounds which are coded as sounding gay and some which aren't. And then sort of the question that this video is trying to, well, I'm not doing any research, I'm trying to summarize the answers that people have come up with, is what exactly are those traits? What are those sounds that sound gay? And also, you know, maybe like why? So right before we really get into it, I want to define what exactly I mean when I say gay voice or gay accent. There's two main sort of ways to define it. The first is to take a bunch of people, take a bunch of men, right? And ask them their sexuality, their self-reported sexuality. And then you record their voices and you match the two. You know, you label the men who self-identified as gay, you label their voices as gay voices, and then the men who self-identified as straight, you label those men as having straight voices, and then you analyze the sound data for all their different voices, and you try and see if there's any traits you can map onto the voices belonging to gay men and any traits you can map onto the voices belonging to straight men. So that's the first way to do it. The second way to do it is to have a bunch of listeners rank the voices they listen to based on how gay or straight the listeners think the voices are, and then to map the data directly onto listener perception instead of speaker self-identified orientation. And a lot of the older studies that I looked at use the first method where they rely on self-identification, and a lot of the newer studies I looked at use the second method where they rely exclusively on listener perception. So it's also important again before. I promise I'm gonna get into it soon, but we have to define some terms. I'm sorry, we just do. So the first one, the really crucial one to know, is what exactly I'm doing this whole time and what you're going to do this whole time, which is a type of linguistics called phonetics, and that just means the study of sounds. It comes from the Greek word phone, which means sound. We're also going to be looking at the highness and lowness of tones, which is pitch. Women tend to have higher pitch like this, and men tend to have lower pitch like this. I can't do very low pitch. Along with how high or low a person's tones are, we're also going to be looking at how much their pitch changes as they speak. So this is called pitch variability. People who have low pitch variability tend to sound very monotone, whereas people with higher pitch variability might sound melodic or even like a little bit excited, and women tend to have higher pitch variability than men. Some sound waves take more energy to be produced than other sound waves. The more energy a sound takes to be produced, the higher intensity that sound is. Intensity very closely correlates with loudness as well as length. So longer and louder sounds tend to be more high intensity sounds. So just like sounds and just like sound waves can have higher or lower intensity, they can also have higher or lower frequencies. And to think about this, it's helpful to remember, wait, I'm gonna put a little picture here. It's helpful to remember that sounds are waves, right? And you can see that there's some parts of the wave that the waves are really close together and they're really skinny and sort of tight and all bunched up. And then there's some parts of the wave where there's a little bit more space between each wave. It's a little bit more loose. And so the places where the waves are really close together are the high frequency parts of the sound, and the places where the wave is a little bit more spread out are the low frequency parts of the sound.
Hi, this is Ella from the future. I'm editing, but I don't think I did a good job explaining why frequency matters. So basically frequency is like the number of sound waves per second, right? And then pitch is how high or low the sound sounds. So pitch is determined by frequency. Frequency is like the raw data, and then pitch is how our brains sort of perceive that data.
Intensity and frequency aren't evenly spread across the whole of a sound. Phoneticians who study the gay voice often measure the intensity of a sound wave and check if it's more intense in the high frequency parts of the wave or in the low frequency parts. And this measurement is called spectral skew. If a sound is more intense in the high frequency parts of the wave, then that sound has a positive spectral skew. And if a sound is more intense in the lower frequency parts of the wave, then it has a negative spectral skew. Positive spectral skew sounds clear and kind of sharp, while negative spectral skew sounds softer. Along with pitch, intensity, and spectral skew, there's another characteristic that can change the way a sound sounds. This characteristic is where exactly the sound is made in the mouth. So basically if it's closer to the front here or the back here. And this is called frontedness for obvious reasons. So I'm going to show you something with the sound S, which usually we think of in English as an S. So I can move my S forward, S, and you see how it starts to sound a little bit more like a, which is like a TH sound. It's really hard to make when you're not doing like a whole word. But let me show you. So, S, do you see? So basically some people have their S is really like farther in the back, and some people have them really close to where the TH sound is, and how far or close to the TH is how fronted that sound is. These are all pretty complex concepts, and there's one more I want to go over it, but I think it'll be an easy one to remember because you probably already know it. It's called creaky voice, but you've probably heard it as vocal fry, like that. And it occurs when your sort of vocal cords are moving so slowly that they're no longer really taut and they get a little bit loose and bunched up. And contrary to popular belief, it's not bad for you, it's fine. It's just another thing that your voice can do. It's really wonderful that we have so many different things our voices can do and so many different sounds we can make. And it's just another sort of tool in your toolbox.
It's also associated with young women, which is why people hate it.
So all of these variables, every single one of them that we're going to be looking at is informed at least partly by social factors. So some of the variables are completely social. For instance, how fronted your S is has absolutely nothing to do with your biology with the shape of your mouth, whatever. It's just how you were socialized to make that sound, which means, you know, how your mom made that sound, how your dad made that sound, how your friends in elementary school made that sound, you know, whatever. And some of the factors we're looking at are made up of a combination of biological and social factors. So a good example of this one is pitch. Pitch is partly biologically informed because it has to do with how long your vocal cords are in your throat. And it's partly social because it's controlled by things like how you move your tongue and how you move your throat and mouth, which are all skills that we learn socially by mimicking the sounds that our caretakers and companions make. And the reason that I chose these phonetic variables to talk about is because they are all gendered. So our society, by which I mean like the United States circa 2023, but you can also apply it to, you know, the United States circa 1980, and frankly also to a lot of other places, but I'm only going to give you a 100% guarantee. Okay, fine. I'm only going to give you a 99.9% guarantee that these factors are gendered for the United States, like around now. Anyway, so in our society, these variables are associated either with femininity or masculinity. And they've all been studied, along with a few others, which I'm going to get into, but they've all been studied when looking at gay speech. Also, guys, like, it's really important to note that when I say behavior is social, I do not mean that it's conscious or controlled. For instance, okay, I have quite a high voice and I draw out my s's. This is not something, well, the high voice is partly biological, but largely these are things that I learned to do in like a social setting, in a social capacity. But I also can't really change them very much. At least it's incredibly difficult for me to change them. Just because something is social does not mean we have control over it, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's being performed any more than any other part of being alive is being performed, which, you know. I mean, I feel really like I'm performing my voice right now because I'm recording myself, and I'm really listening to the way that I sound, and then I'm listening to it played back. So I'm definitely performing a little bit, but the point is, it's not a performance that I have complete control over at all. Okay, we're finally gonna get into it. So what exactly do people think gay speech is? There's two answers to this. One is that people think gay speech is feminine. So gay speech is male speech that more closely resembles female speech, right? And then people also think that gay speech is lisped. You hear about like the gay lisp. And both of these conceptions are sort of true and also not true. It's complicated. Okay, so to go one by one, let's talk about what exactly makes speech feminine. So there's so many things, but we're gonna talk about 9. The first is higher pitch, more pitch variability, longer vowel duration. So that just means you go ah instead of ah, or in practice it would be like cat instead of cat. I'm sorry, it's just really funny to hear myself do this. It also means that women also tend to have clearer vowels. This one is a little bit tricky technically, but basically it means that the vowels are a little bit more dispersed in the word, in the sound, and so they sound a little bit clearer. Women also tend to have longer S's, as well as higher frequency S's, and negatively spectrally skewed S's, and finally fronted S's. There's a lot of stuff about I don't know why, there's so much. And finally, the last variable that we're going to talk about is women tend to use more creaky voice. Creaky voice. I didn't even do that on purpose, it just happened. Wow. Okay, and then the second thing to break down is what exactly a lisp is. There's a few different kinds, but long story short, the lisp that people talk about when they say, oh, gay men lisp, or there's a gay lisp, is a frontal lisp. And that occurs when your S sounds, so your S sounds, and your Z sounds, your Z sounds, are so close to the front of the mouth that they become like the TH sound. And frontal lisps are super common in young children. They're a normal stage of phonological development. If you grew up speaking English as your first language, there's a very high chance you frontally lisped when you were a kid. However, normally people do grow out of it. Okay, is it true? Do gay men have more feminine and lisped voices compared to straight men? Or, in other words, maybe more accurate words, Do gay perceived voices have more feminine and lisped traits than straight perceived voices? So, okay, let's talk about the lisp first because it's kind of easier to get out of the way. Long story short, no, gay men do not lisp. However, gay men have longer and more fronted s's than straight men, and this is often misheard as a lisp, especially in regards to speech pathology. A disproportionate amount of gay men go to speech therapy for lisp, but this is because they're more fronted and they're more feminine is kind of like break our brains a little bit, and we end up mishearing it as a lisp, when in reality it's just a more feminine vocal trait in a more masculine presenting person. It's phonetic confusion, basically. And this is probably because listeners are not used to hearing this phonetic feature in men, so our brains don't really know what to do with it, and we end up labeling it as a developmental problem instead of what it is, which is just normal variance. And there's this interesting phenomenon. So this phonetic trait, like most phonetic traits, occurs pretty early in childhood when we're all learning how to talk. And it creates a phenomenon where gender non-conforming boys are incorrectly sent to speech therapy to de-lispify their voices, but they never actually had a lisp. They weren't actually turning their s's into t, like little th. They were just putting them a little bit more fronted, the way that a lot of, young girls of the same age did. So much like the stereotype of the lisping gay man, the conflation of feminine voice with gay voice is an oversimplification that's rooted in truth. One of the absolutely seminal works in gay voice research was done by Rudolf Gaudio in 1994. So Gaudio aimed to test the theory that gay voices were feminine voices and that straight voices were masculine voices. And to do this, he recorded self-reported gay men and straight men speaking, and then he analyzed their voices for pitch as well as pitch variance, because these are two of the most classic feminine coded traits. His hypothesis was that if gay men spoke in more feminine ways than straight men, then their voices would on average be higher pitched and have more pitch variance. So that did not happen. Gaudio found exactly zero correlation between pitch and sexuality, and then a sort of nebulous, weird correlation between pitch variance and sexuality. And what this study showed is that no matter what gay voice was, we didn't really know at the time, but whatever it was a lot more complicated than just feminine voice. And these findings really they sort of shook the world of sociolinguistics, and they paved the way for all the other studies that I'm going to talk about in this video. So Gaudio's other key finding was that listeners were able to overwhelmingly correctly identify whether a speaker was self-reported gay or self-reported straight. And what this suggested was that gay men did speak differently from their straight counterparts. There was a straight accent and a gay accent. However, with this being said, all traits that correspond to gay voice are normatively feminine traits. Gay-coded voices and feminine-coded voices often overlap a lot. So for instance, there was this study, I'm putting everything here, by the way, because I'm not trying to say the citations out loud. Anyway, there was a study done that showed a really strong correlation between voices listeners would rank as feminine sounding and voices listeners would rank as gay sounding. However, something weird and kind of cool is that the rankings for femininity were consistently lower than the rankings for gayness. So for instance, you'd have a voice recording and it would be 6 out of 10 on a gay scale, but maybe 3 out of 10 on a femininity scale. Whereas you'd have a different voice, which would be, a 2 out of 10 on a gay scale and a 0.5 out of 10 on a femininity scale. So there was this correlation, but there was also a consistent gap between the two ratings, which showed that femininity and gayness are intertwined but non-identical concepts. Okay, also, before I keep going, I want to issue a really big disclaimer. All the data I've already talked about and everything I will talk about in the future has to do with huge general trends across populations. There's enormous overlap and there's a ton of counterexamples. Also, even despite that, the fact that there's enormous individual variance in a population, a lot of the research we have just is not perfect. A lot of it has really small sample sizes. The study pools tend to be kind of homogeneous, made up of a lot of university students and grad students, people in the same social class and social milieu as like the researchers. And the subject pools also trend very white and pretty middle class to upper middle class. Also, disregarding these issues, there's inconsistencies across the studies. So I sort of talked about this earlier, but basically some studies analyze speech samples based on listener perception, and some studies analyze speech samples based on subjects' stated sexual/gender identity, and some studies compare listener perception based on speech samples with self-reported subjects' sexual/gender identity, and it gets really complicated. So when you're trying to compare studies, especially like across time and across researchers, there get to be some inconsistencies and muddy data. It's not always super reliable, and it's hard to sort of it's hard to take in all at once. Do you know what I mean? It gets a little bit weird. Also, the fact that some of these studies used self-reported sexuality means that the participant pool was skewed, where it was only made up of people who were out and who were comfortable enough in their sexuality to take part in a study about it. Also, to get the audio recordings, some studies used free responses, which just means that instead of having speakers read a text, they just had speakers talk, usually answering a question, doing a free response to a question, right? And this could bias the listeners who are listening to the audio samples because they could unintentionally pick up on clues to the speaker's sexualities, because they're also picking up on clues to the speaker's personalities in a free response. It's not purely based on the phonetic aspects of speech, which is like how the speech sounds, but also on the content aspects of speech, as well as the syntactic ones. And, you know, it messes it up a little bit. It muddies the data. However, when you try to avoid this and you have speakers read out loud and then have listeners listen to the data, which is the words being said are completely uniform across the different speakers, this also creates problems because people's reading voices are not always the same as their speaking voices. And whenever you're recording someone, you're always going to get their voice that's maybe a little bit different, a little bit performed, a little bit self-conscious. But when you're recording them and you're making them read something out loud, all of those qualities of the self-consciousness and the performativeness, whatever, you know, they're kind of amplified. And these studies also can't properly control for code switching, which is basically the fact that none of us have one real voice. We all speak differently depending on who we're talking to. And code switching isn't always conscious, so you can't just tell people, oh, you know, just don't code switch, do your most comfortable speaking voice. That's not really how it works. And many of the studies I looked at also failed to control for perceived masculinity and perceived femininity, which means they didn't statistically separate the two, and this could potentially muddy the listeners' reported results. So what I'm really trying to say is that all in all, you can take this with like a ton of grains of salt. If you are listening to me and you feel like these results don't ring true to your life, to your experience, that's really fair. They probably don't. However, as flawed as this research is, and as generalized as all of these observations are, I think that they're still really helpful. And also, frankly, they're all we've got. Okay, so with all this in mind, we can get into the fun part, which is the findings. So the findings are super inconsistent. The best way to make sense of them, I think, is to go through each one of the phonological elements that we discussed earlier, each one of the elements that are correlated with feminine speech, to go through each of those and try to see if those actually seem to be a feature of gay speech or not. Okay, first one, higher pitch. Okay, I already told you this one. No, it's not correlated. There's no correlation. This has been shown like over and over and over. Sometimes it seems like there might actually be a negative correlation in that gay men may actually, on average, at least in certain communities, have a lower pitch on average than straight men, but honestly, like, that hasn't been replicated very much. It's mostly just, there's no correlation, not a thing, no. Okay, number 2, pitch variability, pitch fluctuation. Probably no. So, as I mentioned before, Gaudio's 1994 study found some sort of weird, maybe correlation between increased variability and self-reported sexuality, but when I say kind of weird nebulous correlation, what I mean is that depending on what exact variables he looked at, there sometimes seemed to be a correlation and sometimes didn't, but it wasn't really clear-cut one way or the other. And that study has been replicated. And so in 2007, there was another sort of maybe not correlation. In 2003, there was just no correlation found in another study that they did. So end of the day, probably not. So the third trait that we're going to talk about is longer vowel duration. So probably no. Again, there was a study that showed, yes, gay men did tend to have longer vowels than straight men, but there was another study that just showed no correlation. So probably not. Okay, greater vowel dispersion. Some studies found that there was a correlation. They found that gay men, much like women, tended to have greater vowel dispersion, tended to have clearer vowels. And some studies found that there was absolutely no correlation. Again, this is just because like the studies aren't perfect, and also because the studies aren't on the exact same population. You know, there's a lot of gay men in the United States, and there's a lot of different communities. Okay, so the next one is a longer s. And yes, there was consistently a correlation between longer s's, and speech that was perceived by listeners to be gay. A lot of these data points get sort of clustered together, that maybe it's not actually the longer s which makes you sound gay, it's the higher frequencies and the negative spectral skews. And it's just that length tends to go along with those factors. So if you have those things, you may also do the sound for longer, but it's not actually the length of the sound that's making people think you sound gay, it's the other stuff about it. Okay, higher frequencies.
Hi, this is me editing. I got this section wrong, so I'm just going to tell you. It's a maybe. So, yeah. But a maybe / yes.
Fronted. So this is the thing that gets confused with the lisp. Yes, this is super strongly correlated with gay speech.
It's me again. I forgot again to do something, so I'm doing it now. Basically, I forgot to talk about negatively spectrally skewed, which is actually, that's like the strongest marker out of literally all of them, even stronger than like frontedness. It's really legit. So, and then also like a lot of the findings that seem to be positive about high frequencies actually point maybe towards like what's really important is having just a lot of intensity in the higher frequency parts, which is negative spectral skew. So it's the spectral skew is actually the crucial part in making something sound gay, not the like high frequency itself of this sound.
And finally, creaky voice, vocal fry, whatever you want to call it. Don't call it vocal fry, it's misleading. But I mean, do it if you really want, but don't. Anyway, yeah, so creaky voice has not been studied as extensively as some of these other factors. There is evidence in some studies that creaky voice is a trait of gay speech. However, there's just not that many studies about it. It hasn't been looked at as deeply or as much. And so I'm not going to come and tell you, yes, for sure, this is part of the gay accent. Okay, so basically of these hypothesized indicators, it's really only the stuff about the s sound that has really been consistently correlated with gay sounding speech. And we can also say like with pretty high confidence that certain factors like higher pitch really don't have anything to do with it at all. However, there's also a lot of this stuff which is kind of nebulous and is a maybe not, like pitch variability, creaky voice, longer duration. We're just not sure. Okay, so there's two main reasons why the findings might vary as much as they do. The first is just everything I talked about in the disclaimer section. It might just like not be data that we can trust that much. You know, this might be showing that yes, there's just so many other factors, the sample sizes are so small, you know, the ways that people do the studies are so different. We just haven't, there's one answer on what a gay accent is, and we just haven't quite landed on it, right? That's the first idea. The second idea is a little bit more interesting, and also, frankly, I think a little bit more compelling. And it's that there isn't actually a gay accent. There isn't actually a gay voice, or rather, there's like a lot of different ones, right? So there's a lot of different gay accents, a lot of different gay voices. They all sound to listeners as if they're part of the same accent, the same voice, but they're actually, when you look at them from like a sound wave perspective, from a phonetic perspective, they're not made up of the same traits. And if you're wondering, okay, well then why are they grouped in our minds as the same? It's because no matter what traits they might take or leave out, they're traits that correlate with femininity, right? And so they're traits that gay voices, the multitude of gay voices, are all voices that in some ways deviate from the normative straight masculine voice. And to test this theory, there's a really cool paper that talks about it. I'm putting it up right here. And this paper had listeners listen to the voice recordings of gay cis men, as well as straight cis men, and then trans men of various sexualities. So some gay trans men, straight trans men, bi trans men, you know, whatever, the whole shebang. And the trans men and the gay cis men had different phonological features. They had different phonological traits. Their voices were not the same type of voice. However, they were both rated as sounding gay by listeners. So listeners rated them as having the same gay accent, even though they displayed different phonetic traits. And this is because the thing that united their different voices was the fact that all of their voices had some acoustic features which separated from normative masculinity. And the really interesting thing that the study kind of takes away from this is that it doesn't matter what those features are. I mean, listen, like probably something about is going to be there, but otherwise really like it's not about what features specifically make a voice sound gay. It's about what type of features you have. So for instance, you could have someone with creaky voice and high pitch variability who would sound gay. And then you'd have someone who didn't have those things, but who had, really loud, harsh, strong is, and they would sound gay too. And even though the traits that make them sound gay are different, the result ends up being the same. And this kind of explains like the central mystery that made me want to research this in the first place, which is like, how on earth are gay men throughout time and space having their voices coded in the same way, even though they're not really like all meeting each other or interacting in any way? So they're not teaching each other these voices. So how are they getting the same voice? They're not. Like, that's the answer, is that they're not getting the same voice. We just think they are. There's no gay accent. They're not learning the gay accent somehow from each other, and they're not all innately, genetically somehow born with this accent. It's just that gay people tend to have some sort of gender nonconformity, and gender nonconformity codes as gay. So another sort of helpful way to think about this and to untangle or to remind ourselves that gay coded speech isn't just feminine speech is to think that gay coded speech takes certain elements of female coded speech, certain phonetic traits which are read as feminine, and incorporates them, and it leaves certain ones out. And in certain circumstances, gay coded voices can actually exaggerate the phonetic features of femininity. So a good example of this is drag, where Jeremy Calder did a paper where they looked at the speech of drag queens as they got into drag, and they found that the queens sort of started really like amping up the sort of harshness of their is as they got into drag, as a way of creating this sort of non-normative presentation of femininity. A presentation of femininity that wasn't soft and sort of sweet and, you know, the way that we think that women should be and women's voices should be, but that instead was taking like the sharp elements of femininity and leaving the other, maybe some other ones behind. Okay, why? So up until now, this video has been talking about what exactly makes a gay sounding voice sound gay. And now I want to ask the harder question, which is, what makes gay people sound gay? To answer this, you first have to answer like, okay, well, do gay people actually sound gay, right? Do gay men actually have more gay sounding voices than straight men? Or is it just that some voices sound gay and some of them belong to straight men and some of them belong to gay men? Well, okay, like, no. So mostly, like, yes, some gay men have straight sounding voices and some straight men have gay sounding voices, but there is a correlation between the way that people are going to hear your voice and your self-reported sexuality. Yeah, it's kind of a probably a lot of the time answer. There's some studies, like, again, Gaudio's study 1994 started everything off, that showed that listeners were very accurate at guessing the sexual orientation of speakers, implying that there's a really strong correlation between a gay sounding voice and a gay speaker. There's some other studies that showed only 60% listener accuracy in guessing the sexuality of speakers based on voice recordings, which is like really bad. That's almost as bad as 50-50, which is a completely random guess. So this variance can be explained partly by the diversity of gay sounding voices and also the diversity of the settings where these voices occur. But overall, there seems to be a correlation between gay voices and gay men. And then, so why? Why do gay men have these types of voices? We don't know, but there are some possible partial hypotheses. So one explanation is that men who spend more time growing up with women, so boys who spent more time around women when they were young, tended to take on elements of the women's speech that they were surrounded by. So they tended to take on feminine coded phonetic traits. And then those boys tended to grow up into gay men. So listen, this explains why some straight men have gay coded voices and vice versa. It explains why speaker accuracy might be pretty low in some studies because, like, as we know, spending time around women doesn't actually turn you gay. Also, this theory explains why the phonetic patterns associated with gay voice tend to start so early, in quite early childhood. However, this theory really conflates gay voice and feminine voice, which we already know isn't true. And it also assumes this really weird assumption, which is that gay men in general spent more time with women growing up, which frankly, like, I don't really know. They just pulled that out of a hat. I don't know that that's true. I mean, it could be true, I guess, but it sure hasn't been proven at all. So yeah. Another explanation for why gay coded voices tend to belong to gay men is that it's a way to subconsciously signal to other gay men that you're part of that in-group. And this would explain why gay coded speech has its own unique fingerprints that don't occur in feminine coded speech, why it's really like its own thing. However, this theory doesn't explain why gay speech or speech patterns that sound gay really start emerging in quite early childhood before speakers really are cognizant in many ways of their sexuality at all, and long before they've come out. So these were the only two explanations I found that I even thought, frankly, were worth mentioning. They're both partial, they're pretty fuzzy, and they're completely devoid of any serious data. The real answer to this question is probably a mixture of a bunch of different explanations, some of which we've already found and a lot of which we probably haven't thought of yet. In the end, our conscious minds still haven't caught up to our unconscious ones. We still don't really know why we do the things we do. And so all that we can do as linguists, but also as people who talk and talk to others and listen, is just kind of like sit back and enjoy this really mysterious, strange, beautiful world of human speech.